Solomon Tate was 36 years old when he stepped off a transport at Fort Bragg with 14 months of desert still in his boots, and discovered that his wife had not been waiting. She had been planning. The house was half empty. The joint account held $312. The dog was gone. And Brianna Tate, née Simmons, married 6 years, the woman who had kissed him at the departure gate and said, "Come back to me," had changed the locks on a house that was in both their names, as if the deed were a thing she could revise by simply not discussing it. She was not alone when he got there. He did not go inside. He stood on the porch of the house he had been sending allotment checks to maintain for 14 months, and he looked at the second set of keys on the hook visible through the front window, and he turned around and got back in the rental car. He had been a logistics officer in the United States Army for 11 years. He had managed the movement of personnel, equipment, and capital through 3 deployments across 2 continents. He had made decisions under conditions that would have ended most people's careers or their lives. And he had made them calmly, correctly, and without visible emotion, because that was what the work required. He applied the same standard now. He drove to a hotel on Bragg Boulevard he hasn't checked in, and sat on the edge of the bed and opened his laptop and looked at the account balance, $312, for exactly 60 seconds. Then he opened a different account, an account she did not know existed, with a balance that would have rearranged everything Brianna believed she understood about the man she had married. What Brianna had never thought to ask, not once in 6 years, was what Solomon had been doing with his combat pay, his housing allowance, and the 12-year investment account his grandfather had helped him open at 19. She had never asked because she had never believed there was anything there worth asking about. She was about to understand her mistake in the most documented way possible. What happened next would cost Brianna everything she thought she had secured. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The last morning Solomon Tate had spent in this country before deployment, he had risen at 4:15 without an alarm and the way he always rose. Not because the Army required it of him anymore, but because 11 years of practice had rewired something fundamental in how he met the day. He had made coffee in the kitchen of the house on Vandora Springs Road in Garner, North Carolina. And he had stood at the window over the sink and watched the dark yard and drunk it slowly and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he had developed deliberately and which he considered one of the most useful things the Army had ever taught him. The kitchen had his work in it. The cabinet doors, original hollow core builder grade, he had replaced himself 2 winters ago with solid maple he had cut and finished in the garage. The hardware was brushed nickel. The backsplash was subway tile he had laid on a Saturday while Brianna was out with her sister. He had measured everything twice. The grout lines were even. His grandmother, Vera Tate, had told him when he was 12 years old that a man who worked with his hands on his own house was a man who understood what a home actually cost. She was 79 now and living in a senior community in Fayetteville, 9 miles from Fort Bragg. And she still said things like that with the same calm authority she had always had, the kind that didn't require volume to land. Solomon had called her before he boarded the transport. She had said, "Come back whole." He had said, "Yes, ma'am." It was the only promise he was confident he could keep. Brianna had seen him off at the gate. She had cried, which he had taken as genuine because there was no reason, at that point, to take it otherwise. She was wearing the gray coat she always wore in winter, and she had pressed her face against his chest, and he had held her, and thought, as he always thought at departures, about the specific weight of something you are not sure you will see again. He thought about that moment a great deal in the months that followed, not with bitterness, but with the analytical attention of someone reconstructing an event with new information. He replayed the airport the way he replayed an after-action review. He looked for the things he had missed. He had missed the perfume, which was different. He had missed the phone, which she had kept in her coat pocket with the screen down the entire time. He had missed the way she had not asked him, as she usually did at every departure, what he needed from her while he was gone. She had not asked because she had already decided the answer didn't matter. The other account, the one registered to Tate Capital Management LLC, established 2017 with guidance from a financial advisor named Bernard Cole, who had been Solomon's grandfather's closest friend and had taken Solomon on as a client when he was 24 and still a staff sergeant, had been accumulating without interruption for 9 years. Combat pay, tax-exempt overseas income, a disciplined investment allocation Bernard had built and Solomon had never touched in a panic, not once. Not even during the market disruptions that had made lesser investors sell low. He had held. He had added. He had let it compound. The balance, as of the morning he sat in the hotel on Bragg Boulevard, was $847,000. There was also the rental property in Fayetteville he had purchased in 2020 through the LLC, which generated $1,840 per month in net income. And there was the commercial parcel outside of Garner, which Bernard had identified and Solomon had purchased in 2021 on a 40-year note with a monthly payment he covered from the rental income, and which had appreciated by $190,000 in 3 years, due to commercial development moving in the precise direction Bernard had predicted. Brianna knew about a savings account with $18,000 in it. She knew about his base salary. She had once seen a brokerage statement and asked if that was his retirement account, and he had said yes, which was not entirely a lie. She had not asked what else there was. He had not volunteered it, not out of deception, but out of the same instinct that kept him from discussing operational details. Some things were secure by nature, and security required discretion. He lay back on the hotel bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the $312. He was not angry. Anger was a fuel that burned clean only when it was moving toward something. He had nothing to move toward yet. He needed information first. Start at the beginning, his first commanding officer had told him. Don't skip steps. He picked up his phone and called Bernard. The man's name was Craig Osei. Solomon had his full name within 48 hours, which was faster than he expected and slower than it felt. He had not hired anyone to find it. He had simply called Brianna's sister Tamara, who was the one member of her family who had always been direct with him and who answered on the second ring and said, before he could finish his first sentence, "Solomon, I've been trying to figure out how to call you for 4 months." Craig Osei was 38, an assistant branch manager at a credit union in Raleigh. He drove a leased BMW. He had been dating Brianna, by Tamara's account, for approximately 10 months, which meant it had begun when Solomon was 2 months into his deployment and still sending messages she was still answering with the same warmth she had always used, so that he would not know. He sat with that arithmetic for a while. He did not move. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He opened the joint account on his phone and went back 12 months and built a transaction log in a spreadsheet he created specifically for this purpose. He categorized every transaction. Restaurant charges on evenings that aligned with his scheduled calls when she would have known he was unavailable. Hotel charges in Durham, 3 of them, each on a weekend he had been told she was visiting a college friend. A charge at a jewelry store in Cary, a place he had never bought jewelry. His hands did not shake. The total of what he categorized as anomalous expenditures, money from the joint account spent in ways that did not align with household expenses or her stated activities, was $14,800 over 10 months. Not a massive sum. But the pattern was precise, and in logistics, a precise pattern was a complete communication. He added the joint account drain. She had moved $28,000 from savings to an account he didn't recognize in the 3 weeks after he boarded the transport, which he had not noticed because he trusted her to manage the household and hadn't looked to the spreadsheet. $42,800 total. Documented. Time-stamped. He stared at the spreadsheet for a moment, then saved it to the Tate Capital secure drive, which she had no access to and no knowledge of. He opened a new folder. He named it Vandora. Then he called Bernard. Then he called his attorney. Then last, he called his grandmother, Vera. Vera Tate listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, the line was quiet for 10 seconds. "You know what to do?" she said finally. "Yes, ma'am." "You always did." Another pause. "Come see me before you do any of it." He drove to the senior community the next morning and sat with her in the sunroom off her apartment and drank the tea she made. Too sweet, always too sweet, the way she'd made it his whole life. And she held both his hands across the small table the way she had held them when he was 8 years old and had broken something he wasn't supposed to touch. She said, "The thing about people who underestimate you is that they do all your preparation work for you. She spent 10 months thinking you were manageable. That's 10 months she spent not watching what you were actually doing." He looked at her. "Don't waste her preparation," she said. "Use it." He squeezed her hands. "Yes, ma'am." He drove back to the hotel and called his attorney, Claudette Marsh, whose office was in downtown Raleigh and who had handled his LLC establishment and property closings, and who had told him once, without sentiment, that she didn't take cases she couldn't win. He laid everything out on her conference table the next afternoon. The spreadsheet, the transaction log, the bank records he had already subpoenaed through the joint account access both parties retained, Tamara's documented statement, and the timeline he had built from Brianna's social media location data, which was publicly visible and which, cross-referenced with the anomalous charges, built a near-complete picture. Claudette read through everything with the focus of someone billing by the hour and not wasting a minute of it. She looked up. "Dissipation of marital assets," she said. "The hotel charges, the transfers, the $28,000 move. Documented, time-stamped, and the timeline predates any separation filing." That's what I thought. "The joint account is North Carolina community property. She moved $28,000 without your consent while you were on active deployment." Claudette tapped the transfer record. "That's recoverable, with interest potentially." "What about the house?" Claudette set the papers down and looked at him directly. "The house is marital property. She changed the locks, which is contemptible conduct. But it doesn't affect her interest." She paused. "However, if you acquired any separate property prior to marriage or through inheritance, or through a properly structured separate entity, that property is not on the table." "I know," Solomon said. Claudette studied him for a moment. "What does she think you're worth, Solomon?" He told her the number Brianna knew, the savings account, the base salary, the visible brokerage. Then he told her the real number. Claudette was not a woman who showed surprise. She came close. "She filed for divorce?" she said. "Attorneys contacted me last week. She's asking for the house, half the joint savings, what's left of it, and spousal support." Claudette was quiet for 3 seconds. "She has no idea about the LLC?" "No." "The rental property?" "No." "The commercial parcel?" "No." Claudette picked up her pen. "Then she's playing a hand that isn't as strong as she thinks it is." Solomon nodded. "Give me 3 weeks," she said. He gave her 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Bernard ran a complete asset analysis and prepared the documentation establishing clear separation between Solomon's personal marital estate and the Tate Capital LLC holdings, which had been properly structured with independent legal identity since 2017, 4 years before any marital conduct had become relevant. The structure was clean. Bernard had been careful, as he was always careful, because he had been doing this long enough to know that the value of proper structure was precisely its invisibility until it was needed. Solomon went back to work. He reported to Fort Bragg, completed his reintegration processing, and received his new orders. His evaluation from the prior deployment had come through clean, more than clean. A promotion recommendation was attached. He accepted it without ceremony. He drove to the house on Vandora Springs Road once, on a Tuesday afternoon, to retrieve his grandfather's tools from the garage, which he had always kept there in a locked cabinet of his own installation. He had a key to the garage that did not match the new house locks. He went in, retrieved the tools, and left. He did not go inside the house. He did not see Brianna. He did not leave a note. He owed her no announcement. On the third Friday, Claudette called. Her voice had the particular flatness of an attorney who has finished preparing and is ready to act. "We're ready," she said. "So am I," he said. The mediation was held in a conference room at Claudette's firm on a Wednesday morning. Brianna arrived with her attorney, a man named Keith Alston, who had a good reputation in Raleigh family law, and who had clearly been told by Brianna that the marital estate consisted of the house, the remaining joint savings, and a modest salary. He had prepared accordingly. Solomon arrived in his dress uniform. This was not theater. He had come from a morning obligation at the post and had not changed, because he saw no reason to. But he understood. Watching Keith Alston's eyes move across the uniform and the new rank insignia, that it communicated something before anyone opened a folder. Brianna was already seated when he walked in. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they thought they understood and are suddenly not sure about. Her eyes moved to the rank, then to his face. He sat down across from her and set his hands flat on the table and looked at her steadily. She looked away first. Claudette opened the session by delivering the full asset disclosure package, which was Solomon's legal obligation and which she had structured with the precision of a surgical instrument. The marital estate, the house, the joint account residue, the visible brokerage, was listed in full. Beneath it, in a separate section clearly labeled Non-Marital Separate Property, was the Tate Capital LLC with its current portfolio value, the rental property, and the commercial parcel. Keith Alston read through the disclosure with the focused attention of a man recalibrating. Brianna read it with something different. She read it with the expression of a person who has made a very large decision based on information that has just proven to be catastrophically incomplete. The silence in the room ran for nearly 15 seconds before Keith Alston cleared his throat. "The LLC," he said. "This was established when?" 2017, Claudette said. 2 years prior to the marriage, fully documented, capitalized with premarital assets and deployment income, all properly tracked. The rental property, purchased 2020 through the LLC. LLC funds only. No marital funds involved. The records are in the appendix. Keith looked at his client. Brianna was still reading. Her finger had stopped moving on the page. "The commercial parcel," Keith said. 20 to 21, same structure. Another silence. Brianna looked up. She was looking at Solomon, not at the documents. Her expression had moved through several registers and settled on something that was not quite disbelief and not quite recognition, but somewhere between them. The face of a person assembling a picture they should have assembled years ago and understanding why they hadn't. "Solomon," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You never said anything," she said. "You never asked," he said. Not unkindly, simply as a fact. Her attorney put a hand on the table. "Could we take 10 minutes?" "Of course," Claudette said. Solomon stood and walked to the window and looked out at the Raleigh skyline, the buildings catching the morning light. Behind him, he could hear the low murmur of Keith speaking to Brianna, the rustle of pages. He thought about his grandmother's hands across the tea table. He thought about the maple cabinet doors in the kitchen on Vandora Springs Road and the even grout lines he had measured twice. He thought about the airport in winter, the gray coat, the phone in the pocket with the screen down. He was not angry. He had processed the anger in the hotel room on the first night and set it down like a piece of equipment he no longer needed for this mission. He was clear. Those were different things. When he turned back to the table, Keith Alston was closing his folder. The settlement that followed was, in Claudette's later summary, among the cleanest she had executed. Brianna received her equitable share of the actual marital estate. The house equity split according to North Carolina statute. The remaining joint account balance divided correctly. The visible brokerage allocated properly. She received nothing from the LLC, the rental property, or the commercial parcel, because she had never had a legal claim to any of it. She did not receive spousal support because Claudette had documented, with Tamara's assistance and the transaction log, the dissipation of marital assets, which offset any support consideration entirely. The $28,000 transfer was recovered, with a small amount of statutory interest. Craig Osei was not present and was not discussed. He was not necessary. Brianna signed the settlement documents at 10:45 on a Thursday morning. Solomon was not in the room for the signing. He had already signed his copies the day before. He heard about the signing from Claudette by text message. One line, done. He was in the gym at Fort Bragg when he read it. He finished his set. 18 months after the mediation, Solomon Tate sat in the workshop behind the house he had purchased and renovated in a neighborhood in Fayetteville. A neighborhood he had selected with the same methodical research he applied to everything, close to the post, near good schools, near the senior community where Vera Tate had her sunroom and her too sweet tea and her way of saying the right thing with the fewest possible words. He was building a dining table. Solid white oak, hand-jointed, the kind of table that would seat 8 and hold weight for 50 years if the work was done right. He was building it for his grandmother, because Vera had mentioned once, almost in passing, that she had given away the last table she owned when she moved into the senior community, and sometimes missed having one. Solomon had been thinking about that table for 8 months. A woman named Kendra sat on the workbench at the far end of the shop, reading, her feet up, entirely comfortable in the sawdust and quiet the way only a person who genuinely didn't need anything from the moment could be comfortable in it. She was a civil engineer who worked with the Army Corps of Engineers and had come into Solomon's life through a joint project meeting where she had asked the only question in a room of 20 people that identified the actual structural problem rather than its symptoms. He had introduced himself after. She had looked at his rank insignia and then at his face and said, "You're the one who flagged the supply chain issue in the Rayford project." And he had said yes, and she had said, "I read that analysis twice." They had been careful with each other in the way that people who had both been careless before tended to be careful. It was the right pace. The Tate Capital portfolio had cleared $1.1 million in the prior quarter. The commercial parcel outside Garner had been optioned by a regional developer, a transaction Bernard was managing. that would return a sum Solomon had already decided to reinvest entirely. The rental property in Fayetteville was fully leased. 2 new properties were under evaluation. He heard about Brianna occasionally, through Tamara, who still called. She was in Charlotte. She was working. She was, by all accounts, managing. Craig Osei was not in the picture. That had ended, Tamara said, about 4 months after the settlement, which surprised no one who had looked at the timeline and understood what he had actually been interested in. Solomon did not gloat. He did not savor it. He noted it the way he noted all completed operations, once, accurately, and then filed. He ran his hand along the edge of the tabletop he was joining, feeling for the seam, checking that the glue was holding clean. Vera would put her tea on that table. She would hold grandchildren's hands across it someday. It would carry Sunday dinners and holiday arguments and the particular weight of a family that had lasted because it had been built by people who understood what lasting required. He pressed the joint and held it. Good work didn't announce itself. It just held. He was solvent. He was free. He was home. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.